Let's look at some of the stories on the front and inside the papers. Jack Rowlett, political commentator and campaigner with the pro-housing group Priced Out, joins me. Jack, good morning.
Good morning.
How do you think the government are handling this story? You know, clearly this is going to pique the interest of the public, certainly, to say, right, what do we do if the firearm officers say, we don't feel that we're properly protected to be able to carry out our duties, so therefore we're going to say right now we don't want to do them?
Well, I think ultimately we have to have faith in the rule of law and trust the process. I mean, it comes down to the difficulty of determining the difference, you know, in a general sense, between what might be the tragic result of a well-intentioned split-second decision and what could be the result of a reckless or prejudiced decision instead. But I think it's really important that we can't let the police hold the rule of law to ransom. You know, we have to have these processes in place to use common sense and to investigate when these things happen and to accept that sometimes there will be instances when the police have behaved in a way that is unacceptable, where firearms officers have made the wrong decision and where they need to be held accountable for those actions. And equally, there may be other times when there may be a tragic incident, but ultimately no harm was intended and they didn't make a reckless or prejudiced intention with their decision. And I think we need to have robust procedures in place to determine how police should use firearms. But occasionally, you know, tragic deaths will occur, and that's just a consequence of having police with firearms. Equally, the responsibility is on the police to allow the processes to investigate and to trust those processes and not to refuse to perform their roles when those processes don't give them the outcome they want all the time.
So currently we have a situation where the Ministry of Defence announced they've been put on standby if necessary. That would be in an instant, let's say, when there was a terrorist incident, and we know that the Met Police are sort of recommending safeguards and fewer and speedier investigations into police wrongdoing. We'll have more on this story across the day. The one that's really piquing interest, of course, Jack, is the future of HS2. And I wonder if you agree with George Osborne, who, writing in the paper today, says scrapping HS2 to Manchester would be a gross act of vandalism.
Well, I don't agree with George Osborne on much, but on this, I'm firmly in alignment with him. I think, you know, we look at the state of the railways in this country. We need more capacity. They're crumbling at the moment. We urgently need to take more freight off the roads. We urgently need to have better capacity to deal with the number of passengers who are trying to use our railway as well. And if you're an investor looking at this country this week, and you've seen the government U-turn on net zero and now potentially U-turn on HS2 as well, I think we're in danger of developing a reputation of being somewhere that makes big, grand promises about the future, about how we're going to improve things, about how we're going to provide opportunities for people, and then ultimately, when the going gets tough, doesn't actually deliver upon them.
If we just look at the budget, though, so January 2009, that's when Labour set up HS2 Limited to develop plans for the line. The budget, this was back in 2009, was £37.5 billion. September of this year, government sources say the budget's heading towards £106 billion. I understand the argument you've just laid out there, Jack, but is it worth spending, 60 billion more than we initially anticipated?
Well, I think part of the reason why the costs have spiraled so much is that we've had to make loads of changes to how we're proposing to build HS2 because of the amount of NIMBYism and because of the pandering to people who didn't want a railway line built near them. And because there's been all this political palaver about whether we'll build it or whether we won't build it. There's been so many changes to how we're actually going to go about building it. And that's massively pushed the cost up and massively increased uncertainty. And I think if we'd done what a proper country does, what Spain does, who've built 13 high-speed railways since we last built one, we would have a high-speed rail line well on the way to being built by now.
Why can't we do it like that? Why? What do you think is the problem that we have in Britain, which means we can't seem to build infrastructure like they can in Spain or they can in France?
I think ultimately it comes down to the cowardice of our politicians who aren't prepared to tell people in their constituencies that actually, it might be a bit inconvenient to you to have building work going on near you, or it might be a bit inconvenient to some people to have to move house, although it would be a very limited number. But ultimately, it's in the best interest of the country, and we need better infrastructure if we're to grow our economy, bring people better jobs, and improve the capacity of our railways.
A government spokesperson in the Times has said the HS2 project is already well underway with spades in the ground, and our focus remains on delivering it. I wonder if you believe that promise. We've been asking you this morning if you think spend or scrap it. Have your say by texting 87222. Start your message with the word Times. Jack, the comment piece in the Times today from Trevor Phillips is that his analysis is that Rishi is finally unveiling the real Sunakism. Explain for us what argument Trevor's making and if you agree with him.
So he's saying that Sunak set out before he became an MP, when he was head of a think tank, sort of what he believed, and that lots of those policies he was setting out then in the sort of midpoint of the 2010s are now coming to pass. For example, maths to 18, for example, the proposed crackdown on smoking that was being reported over the weekend. I think the real Sunakism really is turning out to be making this country quite a bland, boring and expensive place to be. It's an ideology which is, judgmental, which strips people of their personal responsibility, which, does nothing to improve the Britain of tomorrow if it requires making a difficult decision today, whether that's, on housing or taxation or net zero. I think he's a pretty visionless prime minister, and maybe he set out that bland vision some time ago. I think it is always interesting to kind of see the root of politicians' decision making and how they've developed their ideas over time. But the ideas are bad ones.
When we look at the kind of job that he's done, do you think we're quite quick to forget how turbulent a situation that he inherited?
I think we have to bear that in mind. But I think when we look at the problems that he's inherited and what he's done in response to those, we look at housing. We have a massive housing crisis. His response to that has been to scrap housing targets and make it harder to build housing. We have the tax burden is far too high. His response to that is seemingly going to be reforms to inheritance tax or cutting inheritance tax. That's a tax that 96% of people don't pay. So I think his priorities are wrong, his strategy is wrong, and his vision is wrong.
Well, that was very clear, Jack. Thank you for your analysis. I think Rishi Sunak is robust enough to deal with that type of criticism. It's a fascinating read from Trevor Phillips inside the comment piece. One major problem for the Prime Minister has been, his 5 pledges. They are not going hugely well. Inflation might be one he commits to. The other problem was, of course, reducing the NHS waiting list. And what we're seeing, it's on the front page of the Telegraph today, the strikes by the NHS staff we saw, of course, are the first ever coordinated strike action from consultants and junior doctors last week. That's going to happen again in a fortnight's time. The strikes mean so far 1 million appointments have been cancelled. And there's no real, Jack, sort of political solution out of this right now, because what we've got is instead a stalemate.
Yeah, I think it's so futile because these, NHS staff have been striking for so long now. They've caused so much damage. We've had, I think, 1 million appointments now cancelled as a result of the strike action. They're playing politics with people's lives, and people are coming to harm as a result of that. And at the same time, the government isn't going to do anything. The government hasn't given in. It won't give in. We're in this awful situation where the strikers aren't getting what they want, and the government, isn't going to change course. It's not going to take radical action to reform healthcare policy in this country, nor is it going to give in. And the people who suffer are the people who use the NHS. If you or a loved one have used it recently, you can see how awful it is and how people are coming to real harm.
What do you mean?
And
how
people are not getting the care they need?
People also are having extremely positive experience of the NHS, which is why they think it's so precious for it to be protected.
I think there's a distinction between saying we need to protect universal healthcare and ensure that remains available for people, and saying we shouldn't, mythologize the NHS or put it up on a pedestal. I've used it recently. I've seen the state of it. I have plenty of friends and family who've used it too, and have been treated really badly by the system because it's not fit for purpose. You go into hospitals and you see people sleeping on the floor. You see people, not being given the care they need. You see different parts of the NHS not talking to other parts, and people, missing vital treatment as a result of that, and often being treated by NHS staff like they're a nuisance or they shouldn't be there. Equally, of course, it's true that there are plenty of NHS staff who are good as well. But I think precisely the problem is that we need to take a step back and say, actually, the goal should be to improve healthcare policy in this country, not to put one model of healthcare or use our NHS as a kind of national religion.
This may soon be Keir Starmer's problem rather than Rishi Sunak's. And looking inside The Guardian this morning, they've said that Labour's gone on a hiring spree across Whitehall in preparation for government. How do you see the opposition? Do they look like a credible government in waiting?
I think increasingly they do. And I think this is a really good example of them trying to become that government in waiting, really. I think this is a recognition that they've not got that much institutional experience of government. You look at the shadow front bench, most of them, weren't around or weren't playing a major role in the Blair or Brown years. I think the Labour Party probably have less experience now of government than the Conservative Party did before they came into power in 2010. So I think by bringing in these former civil servants, it's a sign that Starmer is taking it really seriously and saying, actually, it's not just good enough to be 20 points ahead in the polls and to win and to get into government, but actually we need to be ready once we're there to actually hit the ground running and make stuff happen. Because part of the problem is we've had so much stasis for so long, and there's been so little actual policy going on and actual improvements to the state of the country. And I think it's a really positive sign that Labour are thinking ahead and trying to hit the ground running when or if they win power at the general election next year.
Exactly, when or if, and we'll get a lot more about their policy ideas when the Labour Party conference comes around too. Jack, thank you so much. Jack Rowlett is campaigner with the pro-housing group Priced Out and political commentator with Young Voices UK.